Good afternoon, and thanks for coming to this afternoon's National Press Club Telecom address. Our guest this afternoon is the Prime Minister. We have a small ongoing dispute with the Prime Minister at the Press Club. We think this is his 20th appearance since Labor came to power in 1983. He thinks it's his 21st. But we're not going to quibble over one number. Whatever, 20 appearances on, 21 appearances on, he's always good for business. He hopes last night's statement is good for business too. We'd like to hear from him now. The Prime Minister, Paul Keating.
Thank you very much, Chairman. It's good to be back. Well, if I would begin with a quotation today, you might expect it to be from Ben Chifley or John Deadman or Bevan or Beveridge or some other author of a white paper on employment. I will begin with a quotation. It's a very simple quotation. It's from Samuel Johnson, who is not generally regarded as one of the heroes of the Labor movement. Johnson said, "In a civilised society, we all depend on each other." And I can't think of a better text for the day. I can't think of any more appropriate injunction for Australia in the 1990s or any better broad definition of what this government is about. We are about a civilised society, and we shouldn't underestimate the forces working against us. We ought to think of them. We are as culturally diverse as any country on earth. We have people among us who in other places are sworn enemies, but we do behave with regard for one another. Even though we've got close to 500,000 long-term unemployed, we live in peace with one another. The other force potentially working against our sense of society is the necessity to be competitive. This might encourage us to think that the way to succeed is through a creed of dog eat dog. Some countries whose traditions should have instructed them better did read it that way in the last 20 years. They took the imperatives of economic progress to mean social regress. Well, Australia did not. Australia in the last decade has stuck by its civilised traditions. At every election, including the last, when after 10 years of the same party in office and the worst unemployment figure in 60 years, the temptation was great, the Australian people refused to vote for a dog-eat-dog society. They stuck by the principles which have their origin in the birth of the Labor movement a century ago, and in those true Liberals then who believed that the imperatives of civilisation should temper self-interest. There was, I think, a profound lesson in last year's election. The people of Australia were given a genuine choice. Should Australia take on the ethic of unmitigated self-interest, or should they stand by their own values? Well, it won't have escaped some of you that Labor won that election by making the difference as stark as possible. I know John Hewson has been inclined until recently to say that we ran a scare campaign. My answer to that is read Fight Back. Remember what John Hewson said about the unemployed and the disadvantaged? The echoes of Thatcher and Reagan were clear and unmistakable. The notion that if you reach back for the poor and the weak, they'll drag you down, quite simply, stands for a set of values which Labor will never stand for, and I don't believe Australians will ever stand for either. That remark by John Hewson, as much as Fight Back itself, threw down the political gauntlet. It challenged Australians to abandon a century-old tradition, which even at its worst, in Labor's eyes at least, his own party had never totally abandoned. Labor did not run a scare campaign. It put the traditional view that in a civilised society we all depend on each other. Faced with this stark choice, the Australian people voted for their beliefs. They voted for one nation, not two. They voted for bringing the unemployed along with us. They voted for what I call policies of inclusion, a phrase I notice our opponents are now using. Because the idea of inclusion is unremarkable. It simply encapsulates the idea of a nation, even a nation which for all sorts of geographic, demographic and historical reasons is as loosely constructed as Australia. It encapsulates a nation of people as diverse and easygoing and individualistic as Australians are. It poses no threat to that marvellous reality of Australian life and Australian culture. It simply means we all depend upon each other. The fact that he said it at a time when Samuel Johnson, at the time Samuel Johnson made the remark, Britain was treating her own people abominably, hanging and flogging the poor and preparing to shovel them off to the other side of the world, where they'd be out of sight and out of mind, only goes to show that words are not enough. The only proof is what people do. Whatever our problems as a government since 1983, I hope we at least will be judged as a government which did things. Had words been enough for the government in 1983, we would still be talking about the need for Australia to be a competitive country. We would still be talking about deregulating the economy. We would still be talking about lowering the tariff wall. We would still be talking about opening up to the world and succeeding not just in mining and agriculture, but as a manufacturing nation. And we'd still be talking very largely about succeeding in the Asia Pacific. There are many things we'd still be talking about, but instead we did them. In 1994, Australian workers are doing them, the regions of Australia are doing them. And had we been satisfied with words alone, we might still be talking about the need for extensive and sophisticated social services, about what a nice thing it would be and how consistent with our democratic pioneering traditions if we implemented to an extent greater than any other country in the world the UN Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, or how we might one day recognise that this continent had belonged to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. We could very easily still be talking about these things, but we have done them. In 1994, we live in a country which has few peers in the world in the way it has transformed its economy, developed its social services, extended freedom and opportunity, and maintained its values through an era of extraordinary change. We live in a country which has responded to every challenge, and we should never underestimate this. Few, if any, generations of Australians have proven themselves more comprehending of what the challenge was and what was required to meet it. As a member of the government in these last 11 years, I'm proud that we painted a picture of the reality. As an Australian, I'm much prouder of the fact that the people of this country recognised it. The Labor Party recognised it. The trade union movement and an increasingly large section of the business community recognised it, as the Australian electorate so recognised it. They recognised that cooperation in the workplaces was better than conflict. They recognised that we could be a manufacturing nation without a tariff wall. They recognised that we could succeed in the Asia Pacific. And why did they recognise it? Because they believed in themselves and that in their country there was a wellspring of potential which had not yet been tapped. They had what these days is called a vision, and they knew that the best way of realising it was to work with a common purpose and to work together. In other words, they recognised that in a civilised society we all depend upon each other. The white paper I presented yesterday is prefaced with a reminder of the things I said on election night last year and on Australia Day this year. The words were that we would not leave the unemployed behind. There have been a few critics of this white paper today who say we should leave them behind. They say it in various ways. They never say it directly. They say that to prepare the long-term unemployed for jobs is to create competition for the short-term unemployed. This is the moral equivalent of transportation. It is to say these people have lost their right to a job like other Australians, and we've lost our capacity and our will to get them ready for a job. They are simply a problem and should be ignored. Well, we won't have it. Then there's another argument which says that we shouldn't pick them up and train them and get them back into the labour market where they can enjoy not just an income, but the self-respect and social intercourse and creativity which work provides, because the cost is too high. This is the moral equivalent, not of transportation, but of keeping them on the hulks, keeping them in jail because it's cheaper. It takes no account of what the cost of doing nothing is, the cost to their lives and the cost to ours, the cost to our social cohesion and order if we were to allow an underclass of Australians to form, the cost to our skills, the cost of wasting this potential, and the cost to our civilisation of saying we don't depend on each other, that these people are expendable. There's another argument that's been put. It says that the only way we'll create jobs for these people is to so change our industrial relations system that wage rates and conditions of employment will be debased. This, it seems to me, would be to betray the unemployed as profoundly to neglect as neglect would betray them. It would be truly a cruel hoax on Australia. This argument says that we will substitute an army of working poor for the unemployed. It says we'll abandon our goals of a good and equitable society. We will lower our gaze to a society where differentials of wealth are wide and profound. We will have the same problems of social disorder and alienation decay, but we'll have the unemployment figure down a couple of notches. Essentially the same order, a different set of numbers. The argument is not only devious, regressive and deceitful, it's fundamentally wrong. As the Green Paper pointed out, cutting wages in the Great Depression did not produce a surge in employment. It made those high-minded, comfortable middle-class economists feel morally superior, just as it makes some of our own academic and journalistic pundits feel superior. But it didn't solve the problem then, and it won't solve the problem now. Many of you will have read the Philip Knightley article recently, which describes how in Britain they have lowered wages. Security guards can be paid as little as $2.50 an hour for an 84-hour week. There are women doing piecework for $6.30 a day. The chairman of the company employing them at that rate earned $270,000 a year. He said, and I quote him, "We wouldn't get the productivity if we paid an hourly rate." Well, I'll never accept for Australia the notion of a competitive economy being taken as a synonym for social regression of this kind. Nor do I have to describe to people here the tragedy of American poverty. Some of our opponents point to the American unemployment rate of 6.5% and say that's a model for us to follow. To which I would reply, if you would like to fight the next election on your support for an American social model and our support for an Australian one, we'll be very happy to do so. And as Jeff Kitney pointed out today in the Sydney Morning Herald, America is paying an enormously high price for widening the dispersion of wage rates. Those who criticise the White Paper make one fundamental error, or at least a fundamental misjudgment about this government. A long while ago, we committed ourselves to finding a place for Australia in the very front rank of nations. The point of opening up this economy and deregulating it and lowering tariff walls and building an export culture and best practice was to make sure that Australia became a player in the Premier League. I mean where the technology is, where the high value adding is, where the best jobs are. To opt for any other goal is to opt for a place in the second division, where the second-rate jobs are and where the national pride is missing. Now, we're not going to opt for the Premier Division. Now, we are not going to opt for the Premier Division in the global economy, at the same time opt for a second division in our social goals. We're not going to accept social decay, human alienation, rising levels of crime, a loss of faith and belief, in other words, an underclass cut off from the rest of the world. We did not take the economic path we have to end up with a second-rate country. It's so plainly true, you cannot have a first-rate economy and a second-rate society. Let me give you one little example of what I mean. When McKinsey, in a very extensive survey, surveyed firms in regional Australia, they found that just 4% among them, 4% of the firms thought wage costs were an impediment to growth. Increasing productivity and seeking out new opportunities were the way forward, according to the survey. The White Paper is not proof of success, but it is proof that this government continues to believe that words alone are not enough. We will do what, on a strenuous appraisal, the evidence presents itself as necessary. On that appraisal, it is necessary to sustain economic growth, and much of the White Paper is about the means by which we will do that. We will do it by providing the means for the firms to build, to take advantage of the expanding markets in Australia and the region. It's also necessary to make an effort of unprecedented intensity to lift the long-term unemployed out of the mire in which they're trapped. That is the heart of it. Growth is the means by which it'll be done. The economy, in which skills are our greatest resource, is the economy which we will be developing. Now, I won't go into the details again of how we're going to do that, but let me say that when you examine the document, it should be apparent that it is a document for these times. It brings our labour market, education and training and social security programs up to the 1990s, and they'll serve us well into the 21st century. That's why comparisons with the 1945 White Paper on Employment are largely inappropriate. They are different documents informed by different ideas to meet the imperatives of different times. They have two things in common. The 1945 document was required to find the way to demobilise 1 million servicemen and women, and the 1994 document has set itself the task of finding ways to remobilise 1 million unemployed. That is the first thing they have in common. The second thing is they were both done by Labor governments. Beyond that, they are documents of different periods and different epochs. As I said, the government, the White Paper is not proof of success, and it'll mean that the government is going to introduce these measures and continue the program of growth upon which the measures are built, and sustain that economic growth. Growth is the context, employment, training, support, help is the heart of it. I don't think we can stress enough how great the changes have been, how important it is that we succeed in getting into the front rank. It has been, I suppose, something of a high-wire act. The rewards will be huge, not just because it will maintain our standard of living, but improves them for future generations. There are also basic quality of life considerations involved in this. Yesterday I quoted Chifley's definition of the social safety net, the net under the trapeze artist, to catch him when he falls so that he can climb the ladder of opportunity again. What we're doing with this statement on employment is providing, on behalf of the nation, the net and the ladder for the long-term unemployed and for the youth of Australia. If it is true that in a civilised society we all depend on each other, we have to provide that net, and principally through training and education, the ladder of opportunity. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Prime Minister, and it's now time for our period of questions from our media members. There are a lot of them. The Prime Minister has a busy afternoon. I'm not sure whether we'll be able to get through all of them, but we'll do our best. The first question is from Robert Garran.
Robert Garran from The Australian. Mr Keating, you seem to be proposing to pay for the White Package through a growth dividend arising from faster economic growth and from asset sales. Some pundits, including Reserve Bank Governor Mr Fraser and Ross Garnaut, have argued that the growth dividend should be used to wind back the discretionary rise in the budget deficit of the last 3 years. The bond market's response to the White Paper suggests that many investors agree with them. Are they wrong?
Yes. In short, yes. The notion is that there's a discretionary thing here, that this is a matter of luxury, that the discretion actually extends to some sort of measure of luxury. You know, this is a gold-plated thing the government might not do. Well, the critics of the policy number among those who say, let's leave them. Let's forget them, let's sideline them. Because they know, anyone who has any economic credentials knows, that looking at the 80s experience or any other, economic growth will pick up the new entrants to the labour market, but it won't pick up the long-term unemployed. And the Green Paper estimated that even with economic growth of the magnitude in question, by the end of the century we would still have 300,000 people long-term unemployed. Now, one of the points I made yesterday, I'll make it again today. Complements to skill formation in this recovery will not come from migration. They will come only from our own workforce and people joining our own workforces, new entrants, or retraining and replacing those who are long-term unemployed. So therefore, if we want to keep a high rate of growth and keep away from skills bottlenecks and sustain that rate of growth, and get down the natural rate of unemployment with the sustenance of stable rates of inflation, the only way is to reform the labour market. Therefore, I reject the notion that it is luxurious or that it is discretionary. If you then accept that it isn't discretionary, that it's a thing that any civilised country with sensible and sane values should do, it's something that a government does. The main thing that the things are workable, that they are efficient, that they're well targeted, that there's a very large bang for every dollar, bang for the buck here in the program design and delivery. And if you accept those things, then the deficit which falls from the budget numbers in whatever equation of growth and diminished outlays or pick up in receipts is the one that's appropriate for the country. But the one that we will have with this program, inclusive of this program, will be one within the previously determined target by the government of a budget deficit around 1% of GDP by 1995-96. Now, people are arguing that the marginally diminished financing effects of a $1.7 billion diminished deficit will outstrip the macroeconomic efficiency effects of case managing 500,000 people back into the labour market. That is absolute bunkum, absolute nonsense. And are we to say to a financial market, which lemming-like has sold down long bonds because of a change in monetary policy of 0.75% in the United States and driven up yields in their freight, that in the hands of these great thinkers, that we will have an appropriate dividend for a lower budget deficit at the expense of 500,000 Australians and their livelihood, then we won't be making that calculation. And that's why I answered yes.
The next question is from Ross Peake.
Ross Peake from the Canberra Times, Prime Minister. I was speaking to a manager of a CES branch this morning who incidentally really likes the white package, but the discussion raised two questions. How will you deliver on your guarantee of a job for the long-term unemployed in a small town where unemployment is already high? And secondly, how confident are you that you can change the mindset that employers seem to have against hiring the long-term unemployed?
Well, that's part of the challenge, I think, that faces the whole country, that the government can't do this alone, and we've made that very clear in the paper. That is that this has to be done by everybody. There has to be a premium by all of us on the notion that we are better and stronger if all of us have opportunities of work and enjoying Australian prosperity. Now, you can take the other view. You can take the view that the British manager took. We won't give them an hourly rate because we won't get the productivity. You can drive the wage rates down so you've got essentially a heap of working poor people. I mean, one of the things that President Clinton said to me in Blake Island, going out on the back of the vessel, I remember well, he said, you know, one of the things I want to remedy in this country is the fact the American working poor haven't had a real wage increase in 15 years. Now, that's what's happened in America. You've got a huge body of poor people. And I don't believe we can make that decision. Therefore, it means that we all have to regard full employment, that much of it as we can garner from these changes from economic growth, as an objective for us all. And it means if the government sets up programs that actually provide case management and training where necessary, or a job subsidy, employers should at least take the opportunity of taking people up and giving them a go. And they'll find, I think, that with the retention rates we've been able to secure with many labour market programs, there's a high success rate. And given the fact that a lot of labour market programs now are actually managed through a fairly rigid system, a much more closely arranged and targeted system, a person-to-person case managed system, should mean that the matching between the person and the employer and the attitude of the person should be better. So therefore the retention rates and success rates in jobs of long-term unemployed people should be higher. If that happens, employers may change their mind about the value of taking unemployed people. As well as that, the subsidies are quite high. For someone unemployed 3 years, it's $260 for the first 13 weeks. It drops down to substantially after that, but it's still a substantial benefit. And for $230 for people unemployed 12 months or more. So there is, I think, a value in that. And of course, with the training wage, we've got the prospect of employers taking on young people for training at below award rates because there's some structure on the job training. All of this, I think, leads to good employer-employee relations. That generally leads to ongoing employment. So that's where I think the relationship will be. In country towns, there will always be a problem where there's a dearth of jobs, but one of the things we have in the white paper is a new opportunities program where we might be able to fund some of these payments to community organisations who engage young people and unemployed people in community work. Now, there's a bit of additionality in jobs in the paper. Essentially, it's not about additionality, it's about streaming the long-term unemployed back into the mainstream labour market.
Next question is from Laura Tingle.
Laura Tingle from the Australian Prime Minister. You've said in your speech yesterday and also today in your comments that in this recovery the complement to skill formation in the labour market is not going to come from migration but it's coming from training our own people. I was wondering, given the unemployment crisis and the fact that it's going to take a long time to resolve, what the government's parameters are on establishing a migration program in the medium term.
Well, we'll be, as you may know, Laura, this time each year we announce a migration target for the year. That follows a process of extensive consultations which we have with the states, with employer organisations, with community groups, and this process has been undertaken by my colleague Nick Bolkus, and he'll be reporting to Cabinet shortly with his recommendation for this year's intake. But it needs to be juxtaposed against the view that the migration program was cut from, I think, a high of about 147,000 to just over 80,000 a couple of years ago, and the emphasis there, greater emphasis on family reunion, and therefore the notion that people will have come here and set themselves up here and been housed here ready to participate in the recovery and meet skill shortages at various points in the economy is one that I don't think we ought to substantially rely upon. That's not to say there isn't some skills, additional skills, and some complementary skills coming through. There is, but principally we're going to have to rely upon the natural growth in the workforce, and how could you do that and at the same time ignore 300,000 people, 360,000 people who have been unemployed for 12 months or more, let alone those who have been unemployed for less than 12 months. So this is why we believe that this is an economically efficient thing to do. This is a microeconomic reform of great substance. That's the point. This is a microeconomic reform of great substance. And if we want to see the natural rate of unemployment, the NAIRU, the natural rate of unemployment with a sustainable low rate of inflation at the lowest level possible, then we need to engage these people back into the workforce.
Fran Kelly.
Fran Kelly, ABC Radio. Prime Minister, one of the big promises, and one you've mentioned here again today, is the one-to-one case management of 500,000 people as part of this white paper. That's got to mean at least 2,000 people involved in administering, giving out the case management. Those people currently aren't there. Where are you going to find them, and is this going to turn out to be an overly ambitious promise that can't be fulfilled?
Well, I don't think so. I think though it has a lot of ambition that I would never deny. But the question is it appropriately ambitious? And I think it is. The challenge will be for us to get the systems in place to make the policy work and work well. And that's why I think it is an important feature of the paper that the government has said that notwithstanding a substantial addition of resources to the CES, and a complement to its capacities and training, that it will seek to develop and put incentives to develop a private market for case management, where we will see a whole series of companies and institutions set up. It's very possible, for instance, take the Metal Trades Industry Association, which yesterday issued a very complimentary press statement about the white paper. It is conceivable in capital and provincial cities that an organisation like the MTIA could be a case manager, particularly for people in its industry or other industries. The hotels and tourism industry, for instance, could be another. I mean, I think one of the things we might be able to get from this is not simply devices and organisations to case manage those who are at risk of being long-term unemployed or unemployed, but we'll actually develop a better labour market where employers know how to responsively, in a way where there is a quick and accurate response, go to a case management body, be it the CES or a private one, and go there with confidence for their future needs, future labour market needs, the future needs of the business. And I would hope a better matching of these things should be possible, and this is particularly so with computerisation and ADP equipment more generally available in the economy than, say, 10 or 20 years ago. And bearing in mind, I think the CES places only about 18% of people in employment. Most people find their own job through newspapers or their own individual efforts or networking. And if we can improve that networking and get better matching, we can end up with a really important change from this.
Next question is from Nikki Sava.
Nikki Sava from the Herald Sun, Mr Keating. Can you give an assurance now that the extra spending in the white paper will not be funded
Please again.
Sorry. Can you give an assurance now that the extra funding in the white paper will not need to be funded by increases in spending on new taxes or by increasing existing taxes?
That's the sort of questions disc jockeys normally ask me, or reformed disc jockeys. Out of print journos, I expect more sophisticated questions. And the answer is no. I'm not in the business of giving guarantees and those sorts of things. I mean, it's a week to the budget, and that's, I think, all will be revealed.
Kim Sweetman.
Kim Sweetman from the Courier Mail, Prime Minister. The Regional Development Plan virtually leaves provincial areas to drag themselves up by their bootstraps, while areas like Cairns, which was cited as an example, have managed to develop themselves due to long-term planning. What real hope can you give to the 12% of Australians which are living in areas which are already in decline?
Yeah, well, there seems to be a very clear contradiction in your question. You're saying the people of Cairns, under their own leadership, have made it, but you are not going to let other groups under their own leadership make it. That's the very essence. I mean, the message of the Kelty report and the McKinsey report, that after a vast survey, and in the case of the Kelty Task Force, a most comprehensive visit to the regions of this country and discussions of quality, and also the Industry Commission report. The one key finding was, given that regions with leadership, cohesion, a sense of unity of purpose between local government, municipal bodies, shire organisations, business organisations, trade unions and other community organisations, that regions which have a clear ambition for themselves and work cooperatively invariably do better than those who don't. And so what they found was a lot of the investment in these regions didn't come from outside. It wasn't floating investment, it was investment generated from within the region. And this, I think, is quite a revelation. And because the notion is you've got to have someone jump in from outside and do something they weren't formerly doing. That most of the investment actually came from the region itself. So what we've done in the white paper in response to the recommendations of Bill Kelty's task force and the various other reports was to say, well, look, where there is the establishment of regional economic development organisations, as he recommended, REDOs. We will fund those, and we will let people get in a position where they can actually put together some cogent plans for their region. As well as that, we'll do some other things for them. We'll actually help them with some financial devices to fund capital formation and infrastructure that may be necessary in particular locations. And we had a very substantial change to the tax treatment of infrastructure bonds. We're now giving a 33% tax rebate on infrastructure bonds, where formerly these mightn't have been attractive to low tax taxpayers, such as super funds, who are taxed at a rate of 15% or less. And the same with pool development funds. We've changed the tax treatment of those from 25% to 15%, in the hope that high marginal rate taxpayers can, through the mechanism of the PDF, fund some equity and capital into some of these regions. Now, I think what you'll see in regions is increasingly people will pool their own savings in regions and they'll invest them in regions, because funds management is sophisticating all the time across the economy. You've got, in some regions of Australia, very large collections of retired age people who've got lump sums to invest and what have you. Many of them are invested in capital city organisations. They could be invested in regional organisations, and I think as a consequence of that, we can see regions starting to get their act together and know what they should do and be helped. We've also got there a capital fund, not a large one, but one that can, I think, make clear that for really good capital works that will provide a big regional dividend that's important in a regional sense, the Commonwealth can play a role there with either seed funds or a more substantial role. Now, I think that is the answer. So when we look at Cairns, we've got to say, why is the region of Cairns successful? By and large, because it's got a community committed to a common set of objectives. And I think getting those objectives together is the way to do it. But the notion of pulling them up by their bootstraps, left to their own devices, means the flip side of that remark means the Commonwealth should be simply going along with a very large cheque trying to rebuild these regions, and that's not possible if the regions themselves don't understand what they can do best, how they can do it together, and where we can play a role is helping them do that, helping them conceive their plans and execute them sensibly.
The next question is from Malcolm Farr.
Malcolm Farr from the Telegraph Mirror, Prime Minister. What will be the major occupational groupings of the 1 million jobs the White Paper says will be created between now and the end of the century? And what will be the growth areas in vocational training? Sort of a parallel question. What will be the growth areas in vocational training that will accompany that?
Well, look, I think the general answer to that, Malcolm, would be that 80% of our product comes from the service side of the economy. While we have doubled manufacturing production the last 10 years and tripled manufacturing exports, productivity in manufacturing has probably demonstrated that those involved, the number of people involved in manufacturing, has if not grown, fallen. But our output is greater and our product innovation is better. Now, there is a potential, I think, with small and medium-sized enterprises to employ more people in manufacturing, and that's one of the hopes I have and why I think vocational education is going to be a very important complement to tertiary skills formation. But again, if you look at the service sector of Australia, it's changing all the time. It's far more sophisticated than it was 5 years ago. And we've got services which are now internationally traded, like tourism. We're now earning $9 billion a year from tourism. We were earning virtually nothing. There was a tourism deficit in the early 1980s. And we've been closing that at great speed. So I think that you're going to see it across the economy. But remember this, that we had enormous job growth in the 1980s. Between 1983 and 1989-90, the economy grew on average at 4.5% or around that. What we're saying at that speed, or even slightly more, around 5, ought to be a possibility in a much freer economy than the one that we inherited over a decade ago, where now a lot of microeconomic and structural reform has made it far more flexible. In that context, therefore, the growth in employment which we saw in those years, 2 million jobs, should be capable of being replicated at that kind of rate through the balance of this century. So therefore, I don't have a problem with the notion that in aggregate this can be done. What we need to do, I think, is to make sure that we accept the notion that there are not very many unskilled jobs for young people, that 15 to 19 should be a period of vocational preparation, and in this white paper we're actually reaching into years 11 and 12 to give kids work experience and to set them up vocationally while at school, as well as expanding mightily by 700 million over 4 years, TAFE, and seeing the provision of a private training market in vocational education beyond TAFE, where we have a much closer fix by business and industry on the training needs of the particular institutions, and where business and industry take very close and high interest in training themselves. This is going to, I think, mean that vocational preparation and education is going to rise phoenix-like, I believe, and hope, from what was basically a section of Australian education largely forgotten, and sit beside the universities as a real complement to Australian education and skills.
The next question is from Michael Millett.
Prime Minister, how important is the training wage and ACTU acceptance of it in the overall success of the White Paper agenda? And a somewhat different question, are there any circumstances in which the government would be prepared to revise its deficit reduction program?
Revise
the deficit reduction program.
Well, you know, let me go to the second one first. If we've got such, people are saying to us, you know, you need a lower budget deficit. There's always someone out there bidding the numbers down. At the same time, they'll tell you, oh, well, investment's not quite as strong as it ought to be. Well, if investment's not quite as strong as it ought to be, we don't need the savings complement from an earlier reduction in the deficit. I mean, the rate of withdrawal of the stimulus and the cushioning which the natural stabilisers had in the turnaround in the budget deficit from a surplus of $8 billion to a deficit of 14, a $22 or $23 billion turnaround, meant the Australian economy was saved a lot of pain and grief, even beyond that which it experienced in the course of the recession. I mean, what we found about the recession was it was long rather than deep in terms of the loss to GDP, but it had very large effects on employment. Whether that was through labour hoarding in the 80s, I don't know. So therefore the notion that we should be just, the lowest deficit is the best deficit, belongs simply to the mind of those who have been preaching this stuff for years. You know, putting a monkey on the government's back for no particular virtue than simply the supposed economic virtue of the lowest possible number. So therefore, if the economy performs more strongly, the revenue yield will be greater, the natural shift in the budget balance will become apparent. The key point is that the cyclical changes the government introduced in one nation. You know, I noticed some person on television last night talking about how, you know, the general policy had failed. Yet the economy is growing at 4% and maybe even faster. And you've got to say, what do you mean it failed? I mean, it succeeded, absolutely. And yet the stimulus of one nation has been withdrawn. It was a temporary stimulus. So if you look at the underlying level of the outlays and the receipts, have they been in some way changed on a discretionary basis by the government in some massive way which affects the budget balance? They haven't. And if anyone says, oh, what about the tax cuts? My reply would be, well, without those, the real incidence of tax would have risen. So therefore, the budget balance, as you see it, and its return to surplus, which is now going to be accomplished in this period, is something which we've been able to do because of the great fiscal consolidation of the 1980s. Because Australia had a surplus, it was able to open up the deficit and cushion the effect of the recession upon the economy. Similarly, now the economy is growing, it will come back, and it will come back sensibly. But everyone who says an economy of 400 odd billion of GDP and a budget of 110 billion or thereabouts, look, $1 billion is going to make or break the whole show. We say, well, what kind of vernier dial do you have? You know, what kind of enhanced calibration do you possess? Because there's no doubt that the wallahs of the financial markets have no such vernier dials and no such calibrations. So that's why I believe that the government in these things is correct.
And the question of the training wage and the ACTU?
The training wage? The training wage is important because, for a start, we're trying to get up the concept of a national training award or a national training decision with one rate. So instead of having a multiplicity of rates across various industries as we've had, we end up with one rate which has a discount on the award rate for on-the-job training. Not simply a low rate. I mean, I noticed the Liberals the other day out talking about this thing that theirs called Job Train. They were talking about massive discounts on award wages without any need for training. I mean, theirs was simply the word they used for pushing wages down. You know, but there they were at the front door the other day saying, oh, we thought of this first. Imagine them thinking of anything novel first. Novel, let alone first. I suppose there's a tautology there, but novel it must be first. Anyway, there it is. So, therefore, I think it is an important thing. It can be an important thing for young people and for unemployed people, for an employer to say, well, look, we won't be giving you the award wage, but the discount will be a sensible one, and we'll make that up by on-the-job training, because for many employers, the on-the-job training is the kind they really want. They get somebody that comes to their place or factory, they teach them something, they become of real value to them, and they build a real relationship. That, I think, is the value of the training wage.
Mark Riley.
Mark Riley, Prime Minister from the Sydney Morning Herald. If our focus is going to be on full employment, could you share with us your definition of full employment in percentage terms? And secondly, the best case scenarios seem to be that we're going to be stuck with unemployment of 400 or 500,000 at the turn of the century. To what extent would you and your party accept responsibility for that figure?
Well, we'll accept responsibility for the number, but if we were the government, I think we will be. That is, if we were able to get unemployment down to around 5%, which roughly equates to 500,000 people, where now we've got 1 million people out of work. The way I see things, 500,000 out of work is much better than 1 million out of work. And but understand this point, to get to that, one would have to create well over 1 million jobs, because you're not just talking about 500,000 off the current 1 million, you've got to take all the new entrants to the labour force up between now and then. I mean, I don't know whether you understand this point. Understand? If you think about it, you know you're not dealing with just 1 million. You've got roughly 1 million people there, and then you've got the addition to the workforce in the period. So if you're getting to 500,000, you've got to have well over 1 million. Would we, you're saying, take responsibility for that? Absolutely. Well, that's difficult, I think. What is structural full employment these days in an economy in a massive transition? In the United States, they think it's around 6%. The aim of this white paper, though, is to get down what's called NAIRU, the natural unemployment rate consistent with stable, low inflation. That is, if we have labour market programs this sophisticated, if we have flexibility in the labour market coming from changes in the industrial relations laws, if we have enterprise flexibility in enterprise bargaining, if we have productivity diminishing costs, therefore, with the combination of these things and low inflation, generally sensible outcomes on wages, productivity, profits, etc., it should be possible to lower whatever otherwise one would believe would be the unemployment rate with stable rates of inflation. Now, I don't know what that is. It's certainly, that is, when I say that, let me complete the sentence. I don't know what that is other than to say it's certainly not zero, but we would certainly be within close proximity of making a fine judgment about it were we to have unemployment at 5% by the end of the century. And I think that's the important point.
The next question is from Tony Vermeer.
Tony Vermeer from AAP, Prime Minister. The relative era of peace between the right and the left seems to have ended in a big way in New South Wales and Victoria recently. You plan to privatise airports. That appears to be grist for the mill for more destabilisation between the factions. Are you headed for a big stoush at the ALP National Conference?
I don't think so. Look, the thing is, one of the things the Labor Party, one of the great structural changes for Australia in the last 11 years was that the major party capable of forming a government in its own right has reformed its views, changed the way it's operated, become a party of government and led a process of major, massive national reform. For any nation, this is a major advance. When you see major parties going to seed in Western Europe and the United States and other places in North America, this is a major change. The Labor Party has proven it is the vehicle of social and economic change in Australia, and it's proven it changes itself on the way through it. Now, at every point along the way, whether it was foreign bank entry or whether it was a sale of Qantas, you'll always have these debates. I regard those as fairly healthy, and we've always worked our way through them. The thing is, the Labor Party can change and adapt. What the Coalition has shown is they can't. I mean, every reference of there, they talk about rebuilding by going back to Menzies. They talk about the future by going back to Menzies. And we're told reliably Menzies didn't vote for them in the last 2 elections of his life. Now, I don't think he voted for us either, but we wouldn't want his vote. The thing is, so therefore, I think that the public being quite wise about all of this, looking past the static of the daily media reporting to the points of value, say this is good, here's the Labor Party taking on another thing, and they listen for what the debate's about, and if they form a judgment that, say, an airport can be run efficiently as a private sector organisation, perhaps even more efficiently, they say a good thing is being done here, and if it requires a debate, so be it.
Randall Markey.
Randall Markey from the West Australian newspaper, Prime Minister. Earlier this week you told caucus when the time comes for the next election you will, quote unquote, punch out the coalition's lights. Given that the 2 WA Green senators said last night that they will have problems voting for the legislative based parts of your white paper, and the opposition is toying with the idea of voting against parts of it, although it hasn't specified what it will do, could rejection of any part of the white paper provide you with the double dissolution trigger to punch the coalition's lights out? Well,
One of the things that would restrain me in that, if I punched their lights out, I'd break your heart anyway, and that would displease me no end. Now, the fact is that let's see what the Senate does. Let's see what the Senate. It's always talking about these days. It's always getting minor officials to defend it and telling us how representative it is. This is something for which the government went to an election. It's something I made clear in the course of the campaign. We wouldn't leave the unemployed behind. John Hewson said if you reached back to pick them up, they'll pull the rest of us down. I believe that faced with the structure, order, sense and decency of this policy, the Senate will have no recourse but to pass it.
Jeff Barker.
Jeff Barker from The Age, Prime Minister. You said yesterday that the decade of Labor government had made Australia one of the most sophisticated social democracies in the world. And I note that Professor John Neville of the University of New South Wales has published research showing that the number of Australians living below the Henderson poverty line over the 80s has increased from 9 to 13%, and that general income distribution has become distinctly more unequal, with the rich doing much the best. How does that research square with your view that Australia has become one of the most sophisticated social democracies in the world?
Well, I think Ross Gittins answered this quite well in an article the other day, saying that the poor have become much less poorer, even if some of the wealthy have become wealthier. And as a consequence, if one looks at the transfer payments, which we now have in the well, a number of things. The support for low-paid people in the wage system, the direction of the tax cuts for nearly 10 years to their benefit, the reduction in the bottom rates of tax and the lift in the tax-free threshold, the family allowance and the additional family payment, formerly the family allowance supplement. All of these things and support for I'm just trying to remember this expression, but in the late 80s to early 90s we had a complement to the wages of unskilled, low-paid people, mainly women in the retail and clothing industry. And these things, I think, have changed as with the advent of Medicare and the social wage in general, changed the treatment of the poor in this country. And I mean, you'll always have critics. You can never, from the left and from the right. But I don't think any serious person believes with the safety net, the targeted safety net we have in place today. And there's more of it in this white paper. I mean, here we are in a very marked reform again, taking the joint income testing of an unemployed couple and separating it down the middle and paying half the married rate to one partner and half to the other. And then income testing one, and where the other's income is not affected, as it was under the joint income test, not affected until that person, that unemployed person, has substantially more income. In fact, $230 or more income before $1 is lost under the new taper of the spouse's unemployment benefit or parenting allowance. Another milestone, major change. And let me say, Jeffrey, I was very disappointed with the Age this morning because, frankly, the Sydney Morning Herald's coverage and the Australian coverage beat the Age into the ground. Now, the Age is always going around saying it's sort of part of the sort of Melbourne social laboratory. It's interested in social and economic issues. Your lead story was whinging about the reporting financial market whinges. Mark Baker had one which was peripheral and not to the point, and you've really had to get back into the body of the paper to find out what the government was actually doing. There's a little box on the front page which was indecipherable. Now, where is the Age when we need it? Where is the Age when great social reforms are about and where its former championing of these things doesn't seem to matter that much these days? At least, Jeffrey, you're carrying on the fight, and good on you.
We do have a few more questions, but unfortunately the Prime Minister has a few other people to lecture this afternoon, so we'll have to leave it there. We know you like to whack a bit of marla into you when you're getting ready for these performances, but you've got plenty of marla, so on this occasion we've got some Borodin for you. We're assured that it's something you don't have, but something that you will appreciate. So go and whack that into you.
I will. I have it, but a different version. Thank you very much.